So this event is co-organized by the Southernising Criminology Discussion Group and the Global Criminal Justice Hub, and it's part of our political economy stream. And we are really happy to have Robert Knox today with us, who will talk to us about capital accumulation, racialization, and the politics of ecocide. Rob is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Liverpool and also an editorial board member of Historical Materialism and the London Review of International Law. So he really has the strings of Marxist scholarship in his hands. Rob's research interests are, broadly speaking, on the relationship between law and the political economic structure of capitalism, and his work really on fleshing out the connections between capitalism, race, and international law is really path-breaking. And so if you have a chance, please check out his scholarship. He's really a brilliant writer, and also especially for he really theorizes with lots of clarity and really very incisive logic. So he's really the go-to person if you want to have a better understanding of how Marxist theory can help us understand not just international law, but really the role of race and all these linkages. Rob is really the go-to person. Everyone's here as well. How nice. Okay. He has a particularly great piece on valuing race, stretched Marxism and the logic of imperialism, which was published with the London Review of International Law in 2016. And he has a really classic, really cool piece on strategy and tactics in international law, but also lots of new pieces. So please, check it out. So thank you so much for being with us today, Rob. And please all join me in welcoming Rob to the Center for Criminology.
Hi, everyone. That was a difficult introduction to follow up with, especially because my first apology for a political economic point is that the British rail system is so shit that my plan to write this talk on the trains did not work quite as well as I thought it would. So if you want to then think about that as a problem, we can link that to austerity, the political economy of capitalism, and that can account for why you're like, what is he talking about? Why is he saying this? But we will persevere nonetheless. So the second thing to say is that in a way, what I'm starting to say here is a connection of several different kind of projects that I'm working on and have worked on historically. So partly the work that we were talking about on race and racism and its connection between international law and capitalism, but also some work that I've been doing on the kind of legal concept of ecocide and its value with Dave White and Ignacy Burlat, which is a kind of more practically oriented project that we've been involved in. And what I wanted to do today was think a little bit about how the politics of those two projects can link together in ways that can tell us something about law's utility in these matters and what that might mean for us. And I'm not the only person that's worked on this. So in particular, there's a very good piece by Emily Jones and Eliana Casato, which I would recommend that people read, which is I don't think fully published yet, but it's kind of available in various kind of repositories. And I would recommend reading that. Lots of what I'm going to say overlaps with that, but I think there are differences, and hopefully they'll be useful and productive. Where did I put that water? Which is sensible than opening my laptop. Okay, so why ecocide and why is that important? Well, I think as many of you may have noticed, when you're thinking about the politics of ecology and the politics of people kind of attempting to oppose and contest contemporary problems of ecology, this language of ecocide seems to be everywhere, right? A really, I think, weird example, but kind of useful is in June 2023, in the midst of the kind of Russia-Ukraine war, the Kakova Dam was blown up. And of course, there were lots of different disagreements about who really blew it up, why, what the problems with it were, the kind of normal war talk. But another thing that happened, and a weirdly common feature of that, was this invocation of the language of ecocide. And that came from everywhere. So Ukrainian officials were like, this is a crime of ecocide. What's happened with the destruction of this dam is a kind of destruction of a natural ecology, and that equates to some kind of war crime. Greta Thunberg used the language in this respect, and this was linked, right, to a broader set of criticisms, problems that people were raising in terms of ecocide. Now, what's really important, right, is that this wasn't just a kind of political intervention using a kind of politicized language of ecocide, which, you know, could or could not happen. It was very specifically a reference to and an invocation of a more broadly legal idea, an idea that ecocide could be and ought to be some kind of international crime. And this, of course, is linked, right, to a broader set of things that have been happening, particularly with the Stop Ecocide Foundation, a kind of group of like well-respected lawyers who've come up with what they think of as a definition of an international crime of ecocide. And this has picked up kind of momentum, relevance, states are talking about it, people are using it, and this definition is becoming quite important. Now, I want to think about that crime and more broadly, a kind of cluster of legal and juridical concepts around it, and think about how that is relating to a broader set of politics about ecology and social struggles. One thing I want to start off by doing, and it's a bit of a messy thing, but I think it's worth doing, is distinguishing between what we could call ecocide as a kind of descriptor of a social or material phenomenon. So the idea of ecocide as a concept you might invoke to describe the destruction or the kind of flattening of the ecology, and a specific articulation of a legal concept or crime. Now, in some ways, that's difficult to like really separate out because, of course, in many respects, as we'll discuss, the idea of ecocide grows out of a specific legal articulation. But conceptually, it's quite important to separate those two things out for reasons that will hopefully become clear in this talk. So as I say, like this idea of ecocide as a legal phenomenon, as a crime, has become really, really popular. And of course, the first question we might want to ask is, well, why is that? Why are people turning to the kind of rarefied musings of a bunch of international lawyers? And I think the best way to start with this, and this kind of comes back to a discussion that we were just having earlier about what can we do, is that in a very hopeless seeming situation in which you have forms of political contestation, seemingly fundamental political deadlocks around ecological change, law often seems like it can swoop in and provide us with all the answers and save us from the messy realities of political contestation. And in part, that's because people tend to think of law as being very apolitical. They're like, okay, great. If something's legal, it's not a subject of political contestation. Rather, it is a set of rules or a set of commandments which everyone just has to agree to. So we can circumnavigate, get rid of the messy processes of contestation and just be like, the law, guys, you've got to do that. And that's backed up by this idea of, on that basis, the kind of neutrality of the law as a kind of social form that everyone can get along in, along with the kind of idea of law as possessing forms of material and symbolic power, whereby if you can invoke law, you can invoke a crime, you can visit that with real sanctions, and people don't understand the importance of law symbolically. So the reason that I think people turn to this definition, right, is because they are like, this is how we cut through the deadlock, the bullshit, everything, and instead can articulate a set of like goals or achievements around the idea of undermining ecologically destructive practices. So in this way, right, it's the kind of classic, deliberately or not, liberal strategy of thinking that law can serve as a kind of straitjacket for politics, and that gets us out of all of these problems and lets us get the bad guys. So look, in practice, right, that's a little bit of a caricature, because I'm sure there are plenty of people who invoke it in what they imagine to be a tactical way. They invoke it as a kind of like defensive mechanism, etc., etc., etc. But there's an underlying kind of liberal logic to the invocation of these proposals as being the thing that we want to argue around. So even if people don't think that's what they're doing, in many respects, they're acting as if that's what they think. So I don't think anyone here really knows my work, but anyone who did would know that just on that basis, I don't like it. I've spent like a long time just being like, law is bad, law is not useful, no, 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 no. And so obviously, when faced with something like this, my response is to once again repeat that set of criticisms, right? And there's a whole host of political criticisms that I would have about organizing campaigns around like abstract legal forms, some of which will come up, but I'm not going to precisely recall them here in this talk. Instead, what I want to think about is a very particular structural critique of ecocide law as it stands, but more broadly of the kind of like legal form and its utility and see how this translates into the contemporary political sphere. And essentially what I want to think about is this idea that there are several structural connections, right? And that these structural connections, as I'm about to outline, tell us some of the problems with invoking ecocide as a crime for the purposes of imagining that we can limit the kind of politics of the phenomenon of ecocide. And so those are essentially, firstly, that there is a deep structural connection, as well as a historical connection, between capitalism as a form of like social ordering and ecological destruction. So the political or social phenomenon of ecocide is deeply entwined with and in part a necessary consequence of capitalist social relations. A lot of people have said that, but the next point I want to make, and this is drawing on other work I've done, as I say, is that that structural connection is also mediated and complemented by other forms of structural connection, namely practices of racialization and racism, and very importantly, sorry to say guys, law. And in particular then what I want to say is that if we have this idea of a crime of ecocide as a kind of juridical construct, insofar as we think through these connections, which are both logical, structural, and historical, that crime is also invoking and involved with that set of social relations in ways which might significantly undermine its efficacy and make it very difficult for us to think about it as an organizing political like strategy, tactics, etc. So in order to do that, I'm going to engage in a bunch of probably slightly confusing historical and conceptual wiggles. I wrote wiggles in my notes. I don't know why I did. Moves, right? I'm going to start off by thinking about the kind of theoretical connections between capitalism and ecological destruction and show how that's complemented by law as a social form and race, and show a little bit about how that's played out historically in these connections so that we can think about how that echoes back later. I'm then going to look at the history of the legal concept of ecocide itself, right? And demonstrate how it has changed specifically in terms of its relationship between law and politics, and how to some degree it has started to enact and articulate the problem. Then I'm going to look at the contemporary specific legal kind of definition of ecocide. And what I want to do there is pull out the ways in which how it's articulated is in some ways also articulating in newer ways the set of problems that we're talking about. And I'll conclude by gesturally talking about some political implications of this and what we might do. But as always, obviously, I'm going to sidestep that question and not be like, hey, I solved everything. So the first thing then is thinking about capitalism and ecological destruction. Now, as people may or may not know, right, the Marxist tradition has at certain points been accused, with good reason, of ignoring questions of ecology and ignoring questions of the environment. And that's because Marxism has often been thought of as a kind of productivist, kind of overly industrial focused like set of ideas. And it's been historically associated with particular forms of modernizing regimes and kind of industrializing regimes, which people say, well, what does this say about ecology? As I say, there's some truth in that, but we can also say, I think importantly, over the course of, well, actually even like not just very recently, although it might seem that way, but even from like the 60s and 70s, there has been a very specific set of articulations and elaborations of ecologically focused Marxisms, which attempt to look at the way in which Marxist understandings of the logic of capitalism say important things about ecology. And these, frankly, are complemented by the fact that within the current of what you might call traditional or orthodox Marxism, right, there has always been a quite serious attempt to think through the relationship between capitalism as a mode of production and ecology. Very famously, for instance, and a starting point for lots of people thinking about the relationship between capitalism and the environment, right, has been Marx's own reflections on what he calls the metabolic rift, and the idea that capitalist agrarian forms of production, attuned to the rhythms of capitalist expansion, were disrupting the kind of chemical balances of the soil in such a way as to permanently damage its ability to do that. And that basic idea, right, has been really important in structuring how it is that people thinking about capitalism have understood its relationship to ecological transformation and destruction, and specifically might think about, again, this social phenomenon of ecocide and capitalist social relations. So to give a kind of potted story here, because I don't think we need to have like too much of it, essentially, like what many people I think have correctly argued is there's something in the logic of the way in which capitalist productive relations work, which makes it fundamentally generative of ecological destruction. Now, very often what you'll hear, and this is me being a very like finicky Marxist, so forgive me, but sometimes what people will say is, oh, well, capitalism is fundamentally about growth, unlimited economic growth, and therefore that is a threat to ecology because unlimited growth is a problem. I'm going to explain why I think that's not quite right, but for reasons which will be uninteresting to people, but it's nonetheless a thing that's worth saying, right? So firstly, it's this idea of growth, and the other thing that people say is that capitalism has a necessarily instrumentalizing or kind of logic of rationality because it's like, well, it transforms nature into an instrument, an object, a thing. And again, there's something to that, but it's not quite where I want to go with it. So rather than growth, I think the best way to think about the engine of capitalism in this respect, and we can talk about this a little bit in the questions, because you might be like, well, this stupid distinction, but it's profit as opposed to growth, right? Capitalism as a social system is one driven and regulated by production for profit. And that's because capitalism is composed of a kind of quasi-competitive system in which various capitalists seek to maximize profits, which they can reinvest, expand their profits, expand their profits, expand their profits. And crucially, what kind of Marx and other Marxists have said is that that is a system which is necessarily very difficult to limit because one capitalist will also always be threatened by another capitalist being more profitable, and therefore will have to take measures to increase their profit before they are undermined and outcompeted. So capitalism is this system of the constant search for increased profits and the accumulation of capital, which means getting profit, investing it, expanding, etc., etc. Why is that not growth? Because it's not always going to be growth that, like, capitalists need. A very obvious example recently, right, is we have been living through a period of about, I don't even know how long it is now, a decade of austerity, in which the objective was not growth from the perspective of like various capitalists, it was profit, even if that was sometimes at the expense of economic growth. Like part of the conundrum of many people in the British state is they've suddenly realized that growth and profit do not necessarily coincide because capitalists will happily make profit over things shrinking. But there's this basic idea, right, that capitalism is driven by a continual need to accumulate capital, make profit, and expand, right? Now, what's crucial about that, and why we're not just talking about growth, is that the accumulation of profit and the accumulation of capital is not simply, oh, we need more stuff. That stuff has to be complemented by social transformation. Because capitalism is not just a kind of economic system in some very narrow sense. It's a system of social relations in which production needs to be ordered in particular ways in order to be able to generate that profit continually. So alongside this kind of insatiable drive for profit, capitalism has an insatiable drive for social transformation. If you see the expansion of capitalist social relations into places, that's always accompanied by great, gigantic forms of social change, of breaking down of like labor relationships, the creation of new ones, the kind of privatization of things that will be commons to force people into the workplace, etc., etc. So capitalism is both a machine for profit and also for social transformation and dislocation. Similarly, in a very distinctive vein, ever since the birth of industrial capital, but frankly, even before that, that drive is also built in for a need for like raw materials. Like capitalism essentially needs nature as a kind of fuel for its engine of continually reproducing and expanding this drive for profit. And this means that what capitalism has historically done, and continues to this day, is to both commodify and appropriate nature, to insert nature into this kind of ever-expanding process. This, by the way, is again why I'm skeptical about just thinking of nature instrumentally as being. The issue isn't that nature is being instrumentalized per se, it's that it's being instrumentalized in a very particular and specific way, which is over this necessity for profit-making, transformation, etc. What that means, really crucially, and it's a big insight from the Marxist tradition, is that on this basis, capital always abhors limits. Like, there are not ways that you can really limit this process, because this is a process that on some level is necessarily without end. You cannot say to a firm, do you want to just stop making profit now? Because that is not something that is in the logic of how this works. And that indeed, that is also, as I say, because of the necessity of competition, whereby, well, if you do that, you'll eventually get outcompeted. Now, some people might respond to this and have responded to this and say, like, oh, well, look, what this means that you can do is get green capitalism. All you have to do is incentivize kind of ecological concerns, green concerns to make profit. And, well, hey, what you've now got is a system whereby capitalism is able to reproduce and protect the environment. In practice, that is not the case for several other reasons to do with the logic of capital, which aren't too many more. One is, as we've said already, this idea of like what's called the anarchy of the capitalist market, which is essentially because of the way that capitalist competition works. If someone finds something, you've got to do it before them, you've got to make more money than them. Capitals are constantly in competition with each other, right? But secondly, and really importantly, and this is the transition into, let's say, a kind of the way that this logic plays out in history, is that in practice, of course, capitalism leads to uneven concentrations of wealth, and it's constantly piling up wealth in one place and not in the other. And the way in which capitalism has historically functioned and was born is geographically specific, right? It starts off in Europe, and it involves the spreading out of European states in order to further accumulate both raw materials and profits, such that capitalism is not just a static system which stays in one place, but goes out in a kind of geographical and social way. That's, of course, combined with these kind of raw materials that we're talking about as being distributed in particular parts of the world, with many waves of capital accumulation always being started by a kind of attempt to search out and seek those raw materials in order to provide fuel for these bigger social transformations. And that leads generally to the phenomenon that we would call like imperialism or colonialism, whereby capitalism has to constantly spread and socially transform other regions of the world, but in such a way as them not to be a kind of threat or to be a kind of competitive in a way that's going to be a problem. This is where, to a large degree, race comes back in. Because insofar as capitalism is a system that involves these forms of geographical and social differentiation, that involves these uneven concentrations of wealth and involves social transformation, it needs something which both structures and articulates and undergirds these transformations. And what that has been, historically, and I think continues to be, is through processes of racialization. Capitalism is a kind of like social order which is constantly involved in abstraction. It's constantly taking things out of their concrete context, abstracting them into commodities and other things. And one of the big important abstractions of capitalism at its most systematized are the abstractions of race and racialization, whereby capital, as it expanded into the world, became a machine for taking populations which were not capitalist and articulating how they could be socially transformed. And it does this through practices and languages of racialization. And as capital's kind of logic and nature changes with successive waves of social transformation, so too do patterns and practices of racialization. So Frantz Fanon has a great line about how if you look at the early expansive periods of capitalism, you see a racism which is a more kind of like biological racism, fundamentally oriented to the power of people's arms and legs. But as capital becomes more abstract, as it absorbs more of the non-European world into its own logic, that rearticulates in forms of cultural racism, which can coexist very easily with forms of formal independence. So, insofar as capital is like spreading out and engaged in its ecological destruction, it is also a machine which racializes people. The crucial thing about both of these processes, which are themselves, as I say, mediated through abstractions, is they centrally involve law, right? Think about this just very straightforwardly. If we're thinking about processes of commodification or appropriation, they are undergirded by legal processes which are able to transform nature into commodities or justify or structure the way in which forms of dispossession happen. That's in terms of both natural resources, but also in terms of like populations, indigenous people, native people. So as capitalism expands historically, it conjoins both race and law in ways which ultimately are necessarily ecocidal because they take nature and insert it into a process whereby it becomes a limit which must constantly be overcome and constantly transformed, and one which cannot be tamed or harnessed. So the phenomenon of ecocide, historically, before it was even a legal term, is mediated through racialization and juridical categories, which are fundamentally linked to the kind of logic of capitalism. Now, what's particularly interesting about this, or important, is how that then comes to be articulated in particular forms of racialization. So one of the really interesting things about how racialization has specifically articulated kind of ecological concerns, and something to which we will return later, is that capitalism in part was able to consolidate its social transformations through a language of civilization, whereby particular populations could be designated as ripe for social transformation because they were racialized in particular ways as being inferior, unable to do things, etc., etc. And frequently that was through the category of casting was unable to engage in capitalist social practices, right? But alongside this, and really importantly, this was always taken with a particular kind of ecological articulation, which is ironic, right? But if you look at the language of lawyers and how they understand the problems of natives, a thing they would constantly come back to was the idea of waste and the idea of the improper stewardship of native populations of the land and the environment. In particular, very frequently it was understood that precisely because native or indigenous populations did not engage in practices of capitalist agriculture, they weren't able to properly cultivate the land, take advantage of the land, and in some senses, like sustainably exploit the land. So insofar as capitalism was engaged in kind of ecocidal practices, it was simultaneously justifying those by reference to a racialized inability of non-European people to properly tend to and care for nature in particular kind of ways. So what you get then in the kind of combination of these things is the articulation of a kind of juridical regime in which European countries were acting as environmental saviors in some respects by transforming the social relations in the land, and racialized people were cast as environmentally reckless and unable to manage their own land. And this, of course, is a contradiction in some ways, which is mediated through these practices of racialization. Now, this becomes less and less explicit as time goes on, but undergirds so much of the way in which various capitalist practices are justified. Now, of course, we can say that just sounds like shit, but nonetheless, this becomes a structuring set of justifications for that expansion. So it's that particular connection of things together that I want us to keep in mind for things to which we will then return. Oh, and another thing that I should say, which is very important, is that one of the things that this language of racialization does is it re-articulates what might be problems of like intrinsic problems of the way in which capitalism works and recast them as the fault of racialized people. So if you as a group of people are cast into a set of social relations of a world market, and that world market is just built against you, that is not because of the problems of the market, that is because of the nature of your racialized inability to cope. And that's a second set of justifications which become very important for thinking about the way in which racialization stabilizes capitalist social relations. So that's the setup then, and like very, well, I don't know, how long have I got? 15 minutes or something like that, I think. Like, so what then comes up, right? We're going to think a little bit about the history of this kind of ecocide law and how that might kind of interact with this. And then we're going to close by thinking about contemporary implications of ecocide law. So for those of you who don't know, right, the language of ecocide initially emerges in the kind of 1970s in the context of the Vietnam War. And it's essentially used by a combination of scientists and lawyers to specifically attack the way in which the US was deploying kind of herbicidal weaponry in the context of the Vietnam War. And the idea was essentially that the US, in terms of its kind of military engagement here, had a thorough understanding of the importance of ecology to the functioning of a society, and therefore was deliberately targeting an ecology through the use of Agent Orange and other kind of herbicidal warfare to defeat the Viet Cong on the ground. And actually, at this point, this definition of ecocide, although a legal definition, is drawing significantly on the political analysis of the Viet Cong and the broader kind of third world Marxist and otherwise anti-colonial movements who were articulating a critique of modes of imperial warfare through this language. So when this concept is initially articulated in this period, it is in some sense a much more like insurgent concept. It's one that's very specifically linked to a determinate set of anti-imperialist struggles and relations, and it's articulating those in a legal way. Indeed, precisely the people that were advocating this were not necessarily generic pacifists or people who were just like, war is bad, man. They were also people specifically acting in solidarity and with political understanding and analysis of a particular set of struggles. And it's that marks a lot of the kind of history of the law of ecocide in this period from the kind of the 70s up to the 1980s, where it's actually fairly closely linked to a broader set of struggles within international institutions by the kind of emergent third world movement who were attempting to reshape and contest imperial relations through the utilization of international institutions. This was done with varying degrees of naivety or like faith in those institutions. Very often it was just done tactically, but sometimes it was done with a higher set of faith. But it's gradually, as part of this broader project, defeated, and essentially by the late 1970s, with the defeat of the new international economic order, which I can talk about a little bit later if you want to hear about it, is broadly defeated the idea that international institutions have formed a kind of like set of institutions which might be of use to a kind of like anti-imperialist struggle. Now, with the kind of defeat of those movements, ecocide as a concept still exists, but it's much more denuded of this political context and starts to take on essentially a more legalistic character. With that legalistic character, I'm going to suggest, becoming problematic and in some senses re-articulating some of these issues. So this is true, and let's just say for this point, like two ways. There are more ways than this. So the first is that what you start to see more and more is ecocide's place alongside a kind of history of war crimes and international humanitarian law, as opposed to this more insurgent concept. Now you might think, but that's great, war crimes are bad, so we can all support that. International humanitarian law is excellent, and it's okay. But part of the problem with this is that if you look at the development of international humanitarian law is not developed from below as a way of contesting the politics of warfare or empire. It's actually often directed from above as a way of firstly rationalizing war and making it more efficient. So it's about making violence more rational and efficient in the context of war. And also very often it institutionalized the kind of technological power of like very advanced states. So, the classic example, which we can talk about today, is that, so if you use a weapon which has a non-guided system, you will be violating international humanitarian law by definition. But if you use a massive bomb that kills a bunch of people, you can do a proportionality test. So in this sense, right, that is institutionalizing a technological advantage and a kind of way of doing warfare as against other forms, which may or may not be less destructive. Now, that's not a literal problem for the crime of ecocide, but what it points to is the character of its lineage and a set of like legal arrangements whose job was not to contest, undermine, or undo a set of oppressive social relations. Rather was to rationalize them and very often encode advantages in what ended up being quite racialized ways, with certain forms of warfare essentially cast as savage, as Fred McGray would say, and others not. How does that then articulate itself in an ecological paradigm? At the same time, right, what this also tends towards doing is, as law tends to do, abstract and individualize these issues. So it takes away, it's no longer a critique of a particular mode of imperial war. It's much more of a kind of individualist problem with law itself, which kind of ends up covering up or obscuring deeper social relations which might give rise to those conflicts. And it's that pattern, I'm going to argue, which actually then finally then comes back in some senses in terms of contemporary ecocide law, which then becomes a problem. So now what we're going to do is like fast forward to like the contemporary kind of articulations of ecocide law and think about the ways in which this set of problems manifest themselves in particular ways in that law. Now, crucially, as I've already said, one of the things that happens with these politics of racialization is, and this is especially through law, racialization is a process which is like protean, which transforms and is rearticulated. And in particular, one of the things that happens at the end of the colonial period is the migration of racialization as a kind of purely exclusionary thing into something which is co-articulated with forms of independence and consent, but embeds itself in ways that can continue to justify like oppressive social relations. I'll give you a classic, differently related example, but hopefully you'll see how this makes sense, which is that if you look at international economic instruments, right, they're never like openly or directly racist. They are like, oh, well, this state has consented to take this loan and now we'll have to implement these policies. But you read the reports and they're like, well, the figure is all these lazy kleptocratic people couldn't manage their own economies. So now they have to let in all the Western firms. So in that sense, right, the forms of racialization have migrated from these directly racist things into a set of tropes which then articulated at the same time as consent-based mechanisms. And if we're thinking about it from that perspective, we can start to see the ways in which particular racialized forms are reproduced in subtler ways in many international legal areas. And on some level, I'm going to say now, in the way in which these ecocide proposals have played out. Okay. So the one thing I could have used a PowerPoint for, but I'm not because I hate PowerPoint and think it should die, is the definition, the contemporary definition of ecocide. I'm just going to read it out. Like you can just like listen to it to some degree, but then you can just take my words. I'm definitely right about everything else. But ecocide basically is defined as unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. This is the big thing that people are going for. Now, this sounds very concrete. Sounds great. It doesn't sound great, but we can say it does. But what we can see straight away, right, and a really crucial thing, is what this crime casts ecocide as. We have just said, we bring you all in by pretending we've all agreed, but like, we have said that capitalism systematically, necessarily generates ecocidal relations because capital abhors limits, it's constantly transforming nature and it's using nature in these processes without end, right? The very normal operation of capitalism is ecocidal on a quotidian level. This definition immediately cuts that off. Indeed, it literally is oriented around the idea that the normal operation of capitalism, that's not ecocidal. And what is ecocidal are these kind of mistakes, overestimations, flukes, imbalances, etc., etc., etc. So a critique which understands the socially necessary character of this is now subsumed beneath something which thinks of this as an aberration, right? The obvious example of this, and what sometimes shocks people, don't know if it will shock you guys, but is that one of the things that this definition very explicitly includes is climate change based on fossil fuels. Great, fantastic. We've got a crime that is not dealing with what is probably the most significant ecological threat going on, right? So the headline is that what you've got is a rearticulation of a structural relationship into one which is now presented as exceptional in particular ways. This is a thing that is very reminiscent of what the law always did with capitalism. It tends to take the consequences of capitalism's social organizations and recast or rearticulate them as accidental individual problems, right? And in the colonial period, that was one of the things that race did. It said, oh, poverty isn't a systemic result of capitalism. It's because Black people don't know how to manage their own affairs. That's their problem, right? Now, obviously, I'm not saying that just this act is racist, although it's recapitulating that logic. But the point is, if you then start digging into the way in which definition is then reconstructed, you can see the way to some degree in which some of these racialized and racializing tropes get reproduced in particular problematic ways, which come with the kind of ground of disarticulating capitalism's ecocidal nature from its systemic logic, right? The first obvious point about this, and again, it's just one that's worth saying, is like the definitions of ecocide and the people that defend it are like, this needs to be a crime that can be tried by the International Criminal Court. The famously anti-racist International Criminal Court, which has basically not tried any Europeans, and certainly not any of the classic Europeans, and which primarily has focused on racialized people. Why has it done that? Well, in part of the reason why it's done that is by disarticulating the systemic war-generating relations of capitalism and instead focusing on these particular aberrations. Racialization got to kick in there. So we're dealing already with a court which I don't just think for boring power politics reasons, but also for deeply systemic and structural reasons, is racialized and racializing. And that doesn't matter if the composition of the court is with racialized people. That is part of the logic of the forms of abstraction and the connections between capitalism, law, and processes of racialization that go on. So we get that already. The second point, which is really important to make, and it's kind of a weird, complicated point, but it's probably kind of true, is that if you look at the kind of knowledge requirement, this becomes the problem. So it's unlawful or wanton acts, and again, wanton, like committed with knowledge, there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage. In the context of capitalism's kind of internationalization, the people most likely to have this knowledge are not going to be the people at the top of organizations. It is going to be like middle managers and people that are like locally on the ground. That will very frequently be racialized people who are obviously on some level like in collaboration with international capital, but are not the people that are directing or in charge of this thing. If you look at the kind of people who will often be making those decisions, it will be those people, in part because the literal structure of the way in which transnational capitalism has been ordered is to use subsidiaries and other forms in order to precisely avoid, sorry, my alarm's going off. I was asleep at one point at this, I was having a nap at 4:30. It's deliberately been deployed in such a way as to remove systematic responsibility from people at higher levels and devolve it downwards. And that will frequently be racialized people. And indeed, another point to bear in mind, a point I would like to bear in mind is Oliver Wendell Holmes talks about like the bad man perspective on law. Like look at a law, not for what it's doing, but for what a bad person will do with it. As soon as you see this law, you're just going to start designing your corporate structures in such a way to be like, well, I'm not in fucking trouble. It can be this guy here. So there's already this thing. And if you combine that with the racializing nature of the International Criminal Court and with the kind of exceptionalizing thing of this, we're very likely to get that. The second point, which is linked to this again, and it's articulating all of this together, is that, of course, the other thing that this law is doing is telling a particular kind of story, and I would argue it's a story that reproduces some of that logic of civilization, right? The story is basically, ecocide is an aberration which gets committed when capitalism goes wrong, but it's not part of what it does, generally. And now what it's saying is, when that does happen, the ICC, this pillar of legality based in The Hague, is going to step in and save the kind of primarily non-European world from the consequences of this. It's re-articulating on some level that logic of like savior and saviorism with an international institution, which is then crucially downplaying the degree that law already has in transforming this, downplaying the way in which global capital is structured such that these things tend to happen more in some places than in others, and celebrating then the intervention of this body, which has a very problematic history, as a way of solving these problems. So in this sense, right, it is rather than problematizing the logic of capitalism and its attendant social and political forms, it's saying, well, the problem is when people screw it up, and we're going to have to come in and save them. And in that way, it's reproducing that older, broader racializing logic of civilization. So there are many more things that we could say about this, but it's been 40 minutes. I don't want to talk for too much longer. But what we see in this context, right, is that this definition, by virtue of essentially eschewing the broader systemic and structural logics of the way in which capitalism produces ecocidal relationships, both upholds capitalist social relations on the whole, and also partakes again in some of the ways in which those relations have articulated projects and practices of racialization. So then the question, where I'm going to do a bit of hand waving for 2 minutes, is like, well, what do you do with that? Like, how do you move around with that? Well, I mean, I'm going to suggest a few things here which I just don't think are unimportant. The first thing is, and a criticism that very often gets leveled at me when I say this stuff is like, well, you know, we're just saying one thing. Anyone can do anything they want to do. I think that whenever anyone says that, like, don't trust them. If you have a project that you are advancing, you want people to back your project. Of course you do. You can't be like, yeah, I'm doing this, but I don't really mind if you want to do something else. That's not how the world works. And there's a finite amount of political energy and political organization that people can take. And so if you're advocating something like this, that is where you are channeling this. And you are channeling this in directions which fundamentally uphold those same set of social relations which are causing the problems, right? That's thing one. Thing two is that one thing that people say in response to this is, yeah, but Rob, this will work. Like, what effective thing are you talking about? To which I respond, yes. Famously, the International Criminal Court has been a speedy source of justice, which has very quickly dealt with problems. Oh, no, wait, so it hasn't done that. It's like, well, maybe 10 years after an environmental disaster happens, someone will be in jail. Yay! So actually, this degree of effectiveness is not correct. And primarily, it is the symbolic power which is being drawn upon, even if people don't want to deal with that. So if we're then going to talk about the legal stuff, right? The first thing I'm going to suggest is that, like, insofar as you want to do things with law, but you may, you don't think about its symbolic power, which is often what people want to do, because that symbolic power is too tied up in a set of structural connections with oppressive and exploitative social relations. Instead, maybe you want to do is start thinking about what it is that you can do concretely with law. And that often means moving away from these kind of grand projects. Like, one thing that is probably interesting to think about is, if we talk about ecocidal practices as in some ways like sustained by smaller laws of contracts, of tort, laws of corporate structuring. Actually, sometimes thinking about concrete things that you can do in that way and linking them to broader structural critiques is a more effective way of at least creating a better ground upon which you can contest these oppressive social relations. So rather than thinking that law is like the grand ground on which everything will be decided, you instead think of law as a particular set of tactical concerns which need to be subordinated to broader political campaigns. That's one thing. The other thing then, which is linked to all of this, and again, is honestly a bit hand-wavy sometimes, but I think is worth saying, is one of the problems with relying on these legal moments is there are ways of avoiding organizational questions. Because law, in this sense, seems to step in and provide a missing set of organizational resources about building political organizations, building political subjectivity by circumnavigating that. But if we think of these things as practical questions, the real question is, what forms of political organization and solidarity can you build? How can you target the places in which the system reproduces itself? And what can you do with that? And part of the historic lesson that we have of all of the movements which have contested oppressive social relations is they understood the necessity to build organizations which embraced various forms of social reproduction, various sites of social contestation, and link those together through organizational forms into sets of politics which can contest those relationships, right? And at the same time, what that also means is understanding, again, in a way that and this is not just Ecocide's fault, this is the law in general, the law is very bad at doing, the connections between various social forms and phenomena and this ecocidal destruction. We have said capitalism, racism, and ecocide are all fundamentally interlinked. So a political organization which is meant to contest those things has to understand those linkages and understand that those struggles come together in particular ways which then bear out in organizational fruit. So the struggle against ecocide is also an anti-racist struggle, which has to have that component. And also the anti-racist struggles that we articulate need to understand their place in particular kind of ecologies and the distribution of, ecological related death, essentially. So on this basis, right, rather than look to the grander international legal constructions in this way, we need to understand how they are linked to and sometimes re-articulate the politics and social structures which they seek to contest. And against that, we both need to think about concrete ways in which we can engage with juridical forms, but also understand the necessary project to challenge the social relations is an organizational question which links together the kind of totality of social relations that we face and mobilizes accordingly. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was brilliant. Anyone wants to get us started with a question? Yes.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I mean, it was very engaging, read narratively connections between capitalism, racism, ecocide. Maybe it's me, but I really don't understood the connections between racism and ecocide. I mean, is there, or asking more generally, is there methodology behind this project, like some empirical work? Is there ethnography, archival? I mean, there were so many arguments, so many assumptions. I was a little bit lost in between them. I mean, for example, you suggested that once ecocide is an international crime, companies will organize their structure in a way that the people who will be mainly affected as decision takers will be racialized people. And I mean, if there's one part in the criminal justice system where white old male people are overrepresented as offenders, then it's white collar crime. I'm kind of challenged by these assumptions.
I can respond straight away, or should I just wait more? I don't know what's the practice here.
Maybe go for this and give others a bit of time.
So, I mean, there's a mixture of different things going on. I mean, I would say I overwhelmed you with questions. You overwhelmed me with questions too. So partly what I would say, of course, is that I'm just giving like a 40-minute talk, and so this is not a fully organized, worked out research project. But like, if we're going to then talk about like various things, like obviously like come out of the Marxist tradition, and what I would be primarily engaging is like at least at the kind of the bigger theoretical levels is both theory and kind of historical work, which would be both kind of broader sweeps, but also kind of like more local things, depending on what it is I'm going for. Like I'm maybe not the same kind of social scientist that you are. I'm in a middle department, and so there are things that I won't do, but like at that level, those would be the connections that I would take. Now, I think there are important things that go both ways here, right? Because part of what I think about that is important about like, let's talk about like bigger histories or histories from above, is they have their own kind of payoff for understanding the ways in which systems, but also like powerful people and states work. So if we're thinking about kind of an ethnography, the question would be like, I mean, apart from I can't build a time machine and do an ethnography with whoever, it's like, well, what do we have access to in terms of what and understanding what? But in terms of that connection, what I do know and see, let's just say from engaging with the legal material, is this articulation of like a co-articulation basically of like racializing concepts with ecological language. It's a very common thing to do. It kind of emerges, let's say, with Locke, and it's in a lot of these figures here. And if you go and read through, for instance, some of the kind of really important like legal figures in the 19th century, this is a very common recurring theme in terms of their legal justification. So that this is there fairly clearly in terms of that articulation. That's one thing. And the second thing, of course, is that like once we have that set of like languages and practices, and we think about, and I think again, this is where I'm okay with operating a kind of higher, like broader historical level, the distribution of the way in which ecocidal practices have happened, we can see, right? It's geographically distributed in particular ways, and the geographical distribution of that is frequently justified in racialized and racializing terms. So I think there is that. In terms of the white collar crime thing, I think that's a good point, but part of the issue then is about the particular structures of like social and corporate forms that you are talking about. So white collar crime, it's true, is old men and white men, but it's often not the old white men who are like right at the top. Like they have design structures which have which exist in that way. So often when we talk about white collar crime, we're talking quite specifically about like things that are like more national and have a kind of national dimension. So we already see that distribution of responsibility like down the chain. But of course, because there just aren't that many like racialized people at those levels of responsibility in that chain, that's why in that context it comes out that way. But if we start to think about how that operates in a transnational, international context, right, there you very often do need kind of like liaison people in particular. If you think about, let's say, let's go, we'll do business and human rights stuff, and we'll talk about like garment factories in like Bangladesh, right? The people that run them and tend to be responsible for the bad stuff that happens in them are like local, like capitalists, whatever, who have particular forms of deals and agreements with people higher up. And in a way, precisely because of that structure, the people higher up are like, I didn't know this. Like, we might say, and this is the important thing about how this wording is structured, we could have said, should have known. They don't, because they don't want to ascribe forms of like strict liability responsibility on people. As soon as you move to an actual knowledge test, what you are encouraging is like particular forms of corporate structure which insulate you in particular ways. And so then the context of this in a kind of transnational context, that's how it can become more racialized, because the structures of authority in that context are often more racialized, and very frequently you will need a kind of local subsidiary partner who is not, for want of a better word, white. So I think you're right in one respect, but it is about like how that gets constructed in a transnational way. I also don't think that that's like there's not a bunch of like white people in a room smoking cigars being like, now we're gonna get those managers. It's more like, because this is the structure of how that transnational business looks, and because of the kind of set of arguments that you see, that's just how it tends to end up. And it's definitely of a higher likelihood, especially when you just combine this with the ICC just generally being like trash. But I think that probably answers some of your questions, but not all of them. I can see the skeptical look on your face still. But I also do suspect, to be honest, and this is like probably a genuinely substantive disagreement, which I think you can have, like we also have different methodological conceptions about how we're going to arrive at certain points, right? Like you said, grand narratives. I love a grand narrative. Like,
Great. Yes, please. And then
Thanks for your presentation. I had a couple of questions or comments. The first one concerns the approach to the protection of the environment, which is, of course, an underlying topic when international law designs the idea of the kind of ecocide. I wonder whether if you want or we want to push these race elements, shouldn't we mainly focus on considering that not ecocide, but the protection of the environment should be better included as a category of crimes against humanity? Because on the other hand, ecocide as such adopts by definition an ecocentric approach rather than the anthropocentric approaches that in the end may have some counterproductive effects, actually. That is the period that I see. By pushing this concern, the concerns about colonization or neocolonization, racialization, etc., still we don't leave the anthropocentric sphere to the important. My second question or comment is about whether we should not to have maybe not even expectations at all about what the ICC can do concerning ecocide as a tool to protect the environment and impact on humans. And in other words, to what extent actually we should explore other alternatives besides international criminal justice. And even in terms of victims, the ICC reparation system, unfortunately, is not adhering well. So shouldn't we actually push maybe for the adoption of human rights treaties and the environment following bottom-up approaches? I see more potential, to be honest, adopting kind of regional approaches in which there is some pressure on national criminal investigations. And actually, there is a regional project, the so-called Malabo Protocol Court, you may have heard of that, which includes some destruction of natural resources and protection of natural resources in the context of Africa. So I wonder if national, regional, vis-a-vis international, if we are still considering criminal mechanisms. Thank you.
I mean, I'll just start off by saying I agree with a lot of that. I hate international law. It's just they made me do it and they don't let me stop. So on a basic level, I do agree with that perspective, which is like, because one of the things that we can also say about the international is that it's often a very inaccessible perspective. It's a perspective which is not responsive to things that happen, as you say, from below. Sometimes that can be a virtue because people actually, in some ways, people rely on that because they're like, well, if we get it up here, then no one can complain. But that's not a position I would take, but I think that's part of the thing that people articulate. So I think that's broadly true. But I'm going to then say two things that follow up on that, which I think are important. I'm also just super skeptical about human rights. Human rights, I tend to human rights are a weird one because people like human rights because again they think it's something which is like this is not politics, it's actually human rights. Except then the only effective way of doing human rights is to just do politics anyway. Like I often point to the example of the special rapporteur who came to Britain and was like, austerity is against human rights. And it was like, well, as soon as you said that, man, anyone who believes in austerity just isn't taking you seriously. They're like, you can't turn around to us and say this very normal way of doing things is against human rights. You're smuggling your politics in. So for that, on that basis, right, I am sometimes in these contexts, I'm like, what work is the language of human rights doing for us politically? And how do we articulate it? In part also because it mobilizes the kind of anthropocentrism that you said, but also because I think sometimes that language can actually blunt forms of political analysis that we might want to otherwise use because of the kind of the subjects it kind of envisages, like the politics it conjures up. Like I always like what Susan Marks says about the idea that it's like if you use human rights, sometimes it's very human rights has this idea of harmony, which doesn't make sense. Like sometimes things are bad because some people get something out of it, and that should be your starting point, not oh, rights for everyone. But that's why what I do like though, and where I would always push is the next thing, which is more honestly, I think that talking about let's say let's talk about something like labor rights articulated as a kind of thing where it's well, the conditions in which you work need to not be ecocidal because they're hurting people and hurting the environment, and taking that is more effective than a big human rights claim because it's something that you can organize around more effectively, and it's something that you can have more tangible hitting into. So I think that's important, right? But the thing that international law is doing in a way that I don't like, but in a way that we've got to think through, is that of course the problem is international, right? On a very basic level, if we're thinking about ecological destruction, well, unfortunately, some of it's just happening in places which are not where you live, and you've got to work out a way to articulate some kind of form of opposing and contesting that. And if you're limiting yourself to the juridical, and I'm not suggesting that you are, I understand why people think international law is a thing to do that, because they're well, what else is there? So I think alongside the kind of regional and national things, we got to think about I think it's a political thing, it's not a legal thing. Well, what does that look like? How do you articulate something which understands that? And that is why I think people turn to international law. Now, what I always say about that, but this is again why I would slightly push against the national and regional thing, is we have histories of this. That we have histories of people organizing internationally against stuff. I mean, we have in my tradition the Comintern. Historically, we have ideas of people collectively organizing beyond national lines and political programs. And in a sense, one of the things that law does is it stops people from imagining how they can even do that. So to me, I'm okay, I definitely agree with the points about national and regional stuff, but I think that need to be combined with political, not just imaginaries, but steps of being well, what does that mean organizationally to go beyond that? Because part of the problem of being in the places that are most affected by ecocide is they're often the places that are doing the least to cause it in the first place, right? And that's the central contradiction that needs to be, I think, dealt with. And then in terms of the ecocentric versus anthropocentric, I mean, I honestly, and I think this probably just gets people mad at me. I'm okay with being a bit anthropocentric because but partly because I'm there's a good Jason Moore point, I think, which is I think to some degree it's people are always in environments anyway. Like people are constantly producing environments, and sometimes you can reify that distinction both ways. Where it's like, well, in a sense, if we think about ecology, we have to think about humans in that ecology too, like because humans also form part of an environment and part of an ecology. And so I think sometimes like setting up these oppositions can be actually a political problem. But also then if we're thinking about, I just think, I like to say a very banal, vulgar thing, and I apologize for it in advance, but I'm like, rivers can't represent themselves, so someone's got to do it. And so I think that the politics on some level needs to remain a bit anthropocentric, because that's like the subjects that I think act in conscious political ways are. I think what we can do, but I think this actually in some ways requires a certain kind of anthropocentrism, is like, if human beings always exist in nature, we need to think about what our relationship to nature is, like what ecology do we want to have. But I think that's not about saying like ecocentric or anthropocentric. I think it's like being like, what do human beings in nature want, do, and need, which is, I think, a change of like mindset in some respects. But do you see what I'm saying? Like, I think we still need to keep that in mind.
Can I quickly jump in if that's okay? So I wondered, so I think if I understood correctly, historically, you show a bit how ecocide develops from an insurgent concept, a critical concept that is used in the resistance to the Vietnam War, and then later becomes co-opted, right? And becomes a kind of co-opted concept. And the difference between, or that shift seems to be not so much about law, because both concepts draw on law, even though the latter version more than the former version. But the difference really is the existence of struggle, that the insurgent concept was developed in the context of third world, bottom-up struggles against imperialism. And I wonder what that means in terms of your other idea that you also sort of talked about, which is about the strategies and tactics of using international law. Because if there is no struggle from below, and you talked about how these struggles have been defeated, does it actually make sense at all to talk about strategic or tactical uses of international law? Does the distinction break down in a sense? Because if there's no struggle against imperialism, against capitalism, then what are we talking about in terms of using law tactically? So yeah, I just wanted to.
And that's a good question. And I'll say there are a couple of things I think to respond to that. So you're absolutely right. Struggle was the thing that was animating it. But we can also talk about, as I would, like the limits that the terrain, which is the terrain of international institutions, and the law imposed upon them. Like one of the things that I think happens in that period is people get a bit dizzy with success. Like they keep hitting wins and they're like, we can do anything. And then it just turns out very rapidly that they can't. Because actually part of what had happened in this context was all of the legal struggle was a kind of institutionalization of quite big social victories that in a way often what law was stepping in to do there was like limit the consequences of it in particular ways. Like I've just been teaching students about self-determination, right? And it's like, it's the reason that the colonial powers like largely sat out voting against the colonial declaration is because they were like, it's done. Like we're gonna lose this anyway, so we need to salvage what we can salvage by like agreeing to a form that preserves the state system, that preserves the way in which things are divided. That doesn't mean that there's a kind of infinite whatever, but I think it's important to say, even when we think about struggle animating these things, it's struggle articulated in particular terrains, in particular forms, which circumscribe the limits of what you can do. And sometimes that only appears in retrospect, because it looks like everything's going gravy until it isn't. And actually, if you look at a lot of like the limitations of all of those third world struggles, what often they like floundered against was like a politics of sovereignty, where it was like, well, actually, if you have a consent-based international order based on sovereign states, you can't force anyone to do anything they don't want to do. Like, so what are you going to do the moment that those states object, right? And then the second point we have to recognize is that often what international law represented in this context was a way of holding together a broad front of more or less radical forces, and they could coalesce around international law as like a minimum program. Because like one of the things that I always find funny is we talk about like, and then the third world loves state sovereignty. I'm like, well, that's funny. It's like the Cubans were sending like people in to like violate other people's sovereignty when they thought it was neo-colonial. So it's like, no, like what we got here was this. So the starting point then is like, I think we need to recognize what the limitations of that. I don't think you were saying this, but of course, what some people want to do is be like, oh, but if it was struggle can do everything. I'm like, no, it can't. These things impose limits, right? That's the one. Thing two is that was literally like the highest point of struggle imaginable, which doesn't look like it's coming back in that way anytime soon, or if it is, it's coming back in different forms. It's a very particular conjuncture and balance of forces. But then why do we talk about it strategically now? Well, one reason we do it is because people are talking about it. Like, so part of my problem is like, I would like to not have to give this talk if everyone was just like, no, this is dumb, we're not going to do it. But that's not the case, right? Like, a lot of people think of this as a political avenue. And so if you want to have that discussion, I think it's important to be like, okay, well, I'm going to say to you the context in which something like this could work in a certain kind of way, because you can sometimes mobilize international law in particular ways. Like, to go back to your kind of like domestic national thing, one of the most effective things that happens in my experience with international law is if you're in like a domestic trial and you need a defense, so you pick up an international law defense. So you go like, did this happen with like some of the climate protesters where they were like, well, we're trying to stop like climate crimes from being committed, so this is defense against criminal trespass or whatever. Or in the Iraq War, well, the Iraq was illegal, international law is part of English law, so we're going to invoke this as a national defense. So sometimes what international law can do is in there, and that's where, funnily enough, the kind of inaccessibility of it can be quite useful, is invoke it like that. So I think it's, the point about that is not that there's nothing to do with it, but when you're in a context where people are treating it as the answer, I think you have to respond by asking questions like, why do you think it's the answer? How is it? I'm going to give you some examples of how it might have been used and how it wasn't successful. And now we're going to think through what you might do with it. And you might just be like, sometimes saying it's trash, throw it in a bin. But you might also be like, well, what can we do with it? And so I think the point about that is, right, is to just, like, one of the powers of law generally is like, and again, this is like a Marxist point about like fascism, it mystifies, it's symbolic, people fucking love the law. And so sometimes having these discussions is important, just so that you can be like, no, you don't love the law. Like, law is like grubby, it's involved in this, it's this, it's this, it's this, and now let's think about what we're going to do with it. And I think that is why you want to invoke that, even if actually what you're saying is not much at this point.
Johanna, and then
Yeah, thank you for a super cool presentation. And actually, I feel it also really feels very similar on the national context. Actually, I think that's kind of like really interesting. However, I want to stick to something that I think I already know your answer to, which is again law, but more the question, if we think in the small steps, to which degree, and I also asked this as a person with a criminology background, and I think that we should maybe open up to this a bit more, to also really look more on private law, because I think it has way more potential to think of to reconfigure the material conditions in ways that criminal law definitely has no way to do, I would say. So I wonder to which degree you would see some potential in there, despite your skepticism towards law, because there's lots of discussions going on about like transformative private law and all of these kinds of things. So I would be really interested in what you think of these things.
I mean, everyone thinks I'm going to disagree with that. I agree with that much more. Like, because, well, it's a few things, right? So, like, I think the point is that, like, with a private law discussion, now, this is the proviso. You've got to be deflationary about that. There's no transformative private law. That's trash. But there is a thing that says private law in some part configures the field in which other fights are happening. So if you think tactically about what you want to do with private law to reconfigure the field in such a way that it's going to be more effective, you go nuts with that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, like, and because I'm British, like, for us, like, labor law is a bit private law. You are like, well, okay, what are the ways in which you reconfigure that? Because that reconfigures the terrain in which labor struggles can happen, and they can do what you want to do with them. So, like, obvious point. British labor law is a mixture of weird private and public law. And the private law aspect is the thing that says that if you go on strike, you can be fired. And the public law thing is the thing that comes in to say that if you can try to have struggles around reconfiguring the conditions under which you can take industrial action, you can empower groups of workers to have a much bigger, like, ecological impact than, like, any number of people, like, chaining themselves to a bridge, because you can be like, well, workers in this context will refuse to do this thing because it's ecologically damaging, and they will be protected by the law. If you can do that, that's fantastic. So thinking about the ways in which law, in part, constructs the social field of social struggles is crucial, and I think a thing that's worth doing. Now, my proviso with that is, I do just think a bunch of Americans have gone like very overboard with this, where they're basically like, we can literally change everything if we train more Harvard lawyers who are left wing, and then capitalism will be good. And I'm like, no, I don't think. They're like, capitalism won't even be capitalism because capitalism is just all law. And I'm like, I don't think that, guys. So I think my point is like, we need to hit an understanding here. But it's like, look, it's definitely true that law can configure the social field. And to be honest, people underestimate how much private law can do that. I know why they do that. It's because they sat through a private law class once. I wish I was dead, and then unfortunately, then I can't do this anymore. So there is a problem there, right? But I do think it's important to understand that. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the limits of what that entails. And also, really importantly, we have to understand the organizational consequences of doing that, and then adjust that accordingly. Because one of the broader problems that I would always talk about law is, unless you're very careful, you're going to channel social struggles into a technical language controlled by a bunch of like elites who have access to that language in ways which can ultimately be detrimental to the forms of organizing that you probably need. So basically, I'm like, yes, there is potential. Yes, you have to think it through, but you have to subordinate that to other political struggles, be aware of its limits, and then tactically work out what that's going to entail for you. But I'm actually all for that kind of thing. Like as I was even saying in relation to this, like honestly, having private law things which deal with corporate liability in civil terms is going to be infinitely more effective than putting a mid-level executive in jail. It's also kind of weird, I think, that people who are abolitionists are also like international crime. Well, yeah.
Yes.
Just kind of leading on from that point, I was thinking about like if the law changed, just specifically we talked, you talked about the definition of ecocide, and wanting to have more sort of relation to the social relations that back it up in its roots. My concern is that, like, on a hypothetical level, if we included that in the definition in a statute of the definition of ecocide, there's a certain, the law is supposed to be somewhat apolitical and impartial. My concern would be if you raise that to, the upper bodies, the powers that be, my concern is that it'd get immediately shot down for being far too political in a certain sense. Like, how could we get around that problem? How much can the law do on that level?
I think that's why I don't think the law can do that much. I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the central contradictions about people doing this is there's literally that contradiction, which is like, you appeal to law because it's apolitical, and you think the apolitical thing is what's going to like circumnavigate certain disagreements. But in order to get what you want, you have to be political in a way that someone will just be like, that's not political. It can't be law. Now, that I think is just a kind of literal contradiction in trying to do what you do with law. There's a second problem, of course, which is that law is not apolitical. It just embeds a particular kind of politics. Like the politics that you are talking about there, not that you were talking about, but the apolitical nature of it is itself a politics of the status quo and a politics of a particular kind of social ontology. But I think you're absolutely right about that. But that's why firstly, I'm again, like, I think the grand stuff is less useful than the tinkering, because the tinkering can look technical but add up to something bigger. Now, the reason though, because I think that, so I absolutely just think you're right. This is my problem with like a lot of people trying to mobilize law in particular ways. They can't solve that contradiction. And my problem with it is, if you could convince me that it would be effective, maybe I'd be like, oh, okay, well, I guess we have to do that then. But it's actually generally not that effective anyway on its apolitical basis. And some of its broader kind of, let's say, ideological, symbolic effects are very bad. Like people who believe that ecocide is because bad people do bad things is a problem. So for me, I am just like, I think that does mean that's like a hard limit on what you can do politically, to be honest. Like, unless in certain very charged moments, and they do exist, in moments of real political contestation, you can sometimes overcome that and be like, well, actually, it's not about it being political, apolitical. This is a political battle, and we're going to try and do it this way. Those are incredibly rare. And usually, if law's helping you there, you've already won. Like, it's just like, wait. But I basically think, in a very depressing fashion, you've exactly nailed it, but you've exactly nailed why this is ultimately a problem for me. But what you can think about, for instance, is what edges that you do tinker around, in what ways, and think about if there are alternative legal fora that might be more useful to at least achieve some of those aims. Because I do think part of the thing of ecocide, right? And again, this is what I think is the irony of the abolition thing is. It's like criminal law has, your criminology, you know this outsized symbolic effect on people as being like the thing. But actually criminal law is usually quite bad at doing anything anyway. Like, so it's one of those things where I'm like, I just agree with you, but I think you want me to say like, here's how we're going to solve it, and I can't do that.
No, it was hypothetical.
No, but it's a good hypothetical, but I think it's a hypothetical that exactly shows up the contradiction in thinking of this as a modality of doing what you want it to do.
Great. We do have time for a final question if anyone wants to go. Yes.
Well, I guess I'm curious, the interrelated like matrix between race, capitalism, ecocide talks a lot about the failure of law, international, private, criminal, otherwise. I'm completely with you to address the ecocide. Do you think that works the same then, within the same sort of, obfuscating the fundamental relationships of power as laws against capitalism and race, or whatever laws might exist in capitalism and race? What if we legislated, I mean, you mentioned sort of as the tinkering as an edge case, private labor law protecting workers refusing to, participate in ecologically disadvantageous or destructive, modes of production. Like, is there something there? Is that potentially a way to get around the issue of using the law and ecocide, or is it just simply those three exist in this sort of matrix and the law is insufficient because the law has been historically, I mean, since the enclosure of the commons, has been used to expropriate and to racialize and to produce capitalism?
I mean, the thing is, this is where you can read my famous piece, Strategy and Tactics, which I wrote when I was a child, which is helpful. It's for this reason, right? The central thing I would always want to set up is like, there's no such thing as like not using law. Like, you're living in a society that's constituted by law. There's no magic place where you're like, like you're in it, and you will have to be engaged in juridical relations by definition, right? So that's what you said. I'm definitely not saying like drop out.
Yeah.
But you can then ask the question, which laws in what way, and what does that mean? And you need to think about ways that you deploy them, at least to some degree, run against what those tendencies, and they're just tendencies are, with, I think, an awareness that it ultimately isn't going to like save you. Like, you can, so my point would be, like, you can definitely think about what you do with laws as ways of, like, so firstly, there's a consideration, and the consideration is like, you're gonna have to weigh up like how important you think it is versus not. The second thing you have to do is be like, okay, and on that basis, how can we use this in such a way as to advance the bigger set of things that we talk about? Like, there's a great Rosa Luxemburg quote which is like, the difference between revolutionaries and reformers is not like for pursuing reforms or not. It's like revolutionaries pursue reforms for revolutionary ends, and reformists pursue reforms with just that in mind. So then the question becomes, if you're pursuing this set of legal changes, like, what purposes are you pursuing them for? Crucially, like, how is that being mediated or mandated, like, organizationally? Because like, if you're in a trade union that is like, we're doing this because of this reason, but obviously this isn't like saving us, that is partly cutting against some of this like ideological like baggage in that kind of way. So it's not about abandoning it necessarily, but it's understanding about when, how, and where it's effective, and in what ways it can be most effective. One of the reasons I think that ecocide is so ineffective is partly because the level at which it's articulated, which is this international level. Partly it's because it's a criminal thing, and partly because it's in this thing which is very difficult to be responsive to social struggles in a way that might be useful. And then the question I ask is, what energy is it sucking up? Because the problem is, and this is why you've always got to be careful what you do with law, the kind of symbolic power that comes from laws like close connection to like the very way in which capitalism functions, you always got to be really careful, because again, people just love it. Like, if you can give someone a rights campaign, they're like, oh my god, rights campaign. Like, and you need to avoid that. So you have to like, well, if I'm going to have a rights campaign, how am I articulating with a different kind of political message and organizational message? How am I showing essentially that, like, I'm always just like, you do this openly instrumentally. Like, that's my whole big thing is it's like, you be functionally instrumental. If you're in a court, they're not like, I heard from outside the court saying this was instrumental, so it wasn't going to happen. Like, you pursue it in that kind of sense, openly, politically, and you do what you want. And also sometimes the other thing is, depending on certain context, you understand that like the juridical space is also a space when you can do other things. At like some of the high points of revolutionary struggles, people weren't in courtrooms trying to make legal arguments. They were in courtrooms making political arguments, but understanding that the courtroom was a space in which they could make those political arguments more effectively than elsewhere. That's a question for like tactical deliberation at the time. So I'm definitely not writing it all off. I am like, be aware of the structural constraints. Like the obvious point, which I always want to make, is like, I'd like more wages at work, but I'd also like to abolish the wage system. So it doesn't mean I'm not going to pursue more wages at work, but it does mean I'm going to have to think about how I do that and what that means politically.
Awesome. That was a really great sort of summing it all up. Thank you so much, Rob. And yeah, please clap on. Yes, and you can stick around with some cheese and coffee left. You can join us for drinks.
Are you leaving? Conversation about creative strategies within like border violence as well, like how. Yeah, I'm just here. Okay, that's the card says violence and things like that, but I don't know. I don't know if it's something that like non-reformist reforms kind of.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, listen, the law started. Law started. So, started on the law since the 16th century. But what law is the principle destruction of which society begins. Because religion died.
Maybe not for you, but
A guy that being loved.
Yeah, exactly. So if we don't have